Okay, so a couple of weeks back, me and Rob went to a conference called Responsive Day Act. So that conference obviously is about responsive design, and it was the third and last conference. It's organised by ClearLeft, which is a studio based in Brighton. So, oh, you awesome. So it was at the Dome, just outside the Pirates, in the centre of Brighton. So we had a nice walk around. As you can see, we worked really, really hard. We didn't sightseeing at all. We didn't have a lot of nice food either. That was a breakfast, amazing.
Was
technically he copied me because I picked that, and he was like, "Oh, I want the same."
So yes, it was only a single day. It wasn't like a multi-day event, and there was only one track of talks, so there was no missing of any speakers. There were 4 parts. The day was split into 4 parts, and there were 3 speakers per part, and each speaker had about 20 minutes to talk about their subject. And after the end of the third speaker, there was a small round table to talk about the speaker's subjects in a bit more detail. It was a bit of a brain dump knowledge, just so much going on, but we managed to pick up a few things.
So yeah, the talk is actually going to be more about themes. We're not going to go through what was the talks, each talk about. We're just going to we picked up the main points, and then we're just going to talk about what they said. So we're not referring any speakers or anything. But one of the first theme was the main theme really, because 4 speakers spoke about it, was accessibility. The first talk actually is a business case for accessibility. Will making your site accessible actually make you more money? And to the speaker dismay, actually, she was like, "No, I can't find anything. There is nothing available. But you should do it because it's best practice." Really, the only thing she could find that the reason you should do it for money is because if you're in America, they'll just sue you if your site is not accessible and people can't get information. But really, she was like, we should just do it because it is good practice. So it was like, if you don't make your site accessible, really, you don't know how, it's not just for disabled people, it's for also people who are not familiar with technology. It's for people who are on the go as well. So if you don't make your site accessible, they might be on a crappy device, crappy connection, so make it easy and accessible. The other points?
Yeah, so there's a number of tools that you can use to help you out with this. Kicking off with a really good book by 5 Simple Steps. This will go through sort of how to make your site a bit more readable for those who are colour vision impaired. So there's a couple of good techniques in there, but when you want to test out whatever you're designing, there's a little app called Colour Oracle, which is available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Basically, it takes the guesswork out designing for colour blindness because it shows you what they see. And then once you've had a look at that, you can use a tool like Contrast Ratio by Leah Veru, which basically takes 2 colours and shows you the luminance difference between the 2. So you can work out if it's got enough colour, basically, colour difference between the 2. And the final tool that they mentioned was a tool called HTML Code Sniffer. This is more for us developers, but basically we can validate our sites against any spec we want. So whether it's W3Cs, HTMLs, or in this case the WCAG, which is the colour standard. So yeah, there's a couple of tools there.
So one of the other things about explaining that the web is actually a generalist paradise. We're overwhelmed by choice, new technology, methodology happening every day. So with more choice, actually too much choice, we start to panic. Because we can never really master things before we have to change, learn again, and start all over again, really. So sometimes people start ignoring things and start losing motivations. So what they were trying to say really is don't be ashamed. Even though you feel like you're always behind, you're beginners over and over again, you shouldn't dismiss yourself for that. because being a generalist makes you adaptable, which means whatever we put in front of you, you'll just do it. You just, put your head down, work, learn it, accept, rise to the challenge. And actually, it's a really rare skill to be able to do everything and do it well. Even though you might not be an expert, you can do it to a good level. So, don't be ashamed. And the web needs people like us.
Another talk that went on was about modular design. Now, a lot of people are moving away from designing full-on pages to designing systems. And a modular approach is really popular for this because modules are replaceable, reusable, scalable, and they're also easier to test. This approach seems very easy on the surface, but implementing it can take a few changes in the design process. Two main things in particular are the language that you use and the design process itself. So what I mean by modular design is you take smallest possible part of your design, so you would call it atom. In a web case, it would be like a button or something like that. You then assemble them into molecules, so that might be a search part of the site. And then you begin assembling that into organisms, which may be like the header bar, and then the template, which would be the entire page. As I mentioned earlier, language is really important with this because meaning is complex and it's hard to translate. So we should definitely start with language first and not the actual interface. Until you find the right name for something, it doesn't really exist. So the debate must be had to discover what function it has. Now you could give it a presentational name, such as pink button, but that limits its future. Whereas if you give it a functional name, you basically give it much more scope to work with. But functional names are quite difficult to come up with. So it helps to zoom out onto the whole UI. So she showed this sort of screenshot, which is a culmination of lots of areas of their site, but it allowed them to sort of see where common patterns were and what they might call it. So the example she gave was this bit here is used everywhere, and I think originally they were calling it like hero images, whereas actually they decided, well, it's more of like a banner. You should definitely discuss language with all of the stakeholders, not just designers and developers, but also copywriters and even your end users. And also make sure you use the language while you're doing the design process, because otherwise it won't evolve and it may actually even die if you don't use it, which means you have to start all over again. Now, making a pattern library is probably one of the best ways to discover language. I think the RCN guys did that, so it worked really well. Even user testing is different because traditional user testing is where you take them through a flow of your website or whatever you're making. What they do instead is they give them cards to these modules and they let the users rearrange them. A bit like they would like a Lego kit, for instance, and see what works and what doesn't based on what they come up with. Component-based design doesn't mean you should start smallest. If it suits, you could start with a bigger picture first and then deconstruct that down into smaller modules. But the leading question that she left with was, when you've got all these modules that work in millions of different combinations, how do you keep the design story? How do you keep the composition and the balance? Because you could have a header. In theory, you could have a header at the bottom. So she mentioned you have to set specific rules and constrict yourself to make sure that you still keep it coherent.
So that was, well, not really technical, but slightly more technical than the other talk we had. It's about solving problem with CSS selectors. So it's probably one of my favorite because it's just doing CSS really clever, really, really clever. So we all know what selectors are. We use them in CSS. We use them with jQuery. And it's just an easy way to target element depending on their states, their position. But really, there's a lot more you can do with it. So one of the first things he talked about was quantity query. I know some people already know about it. So what's a quantity query? Is say you want to style a page depending on its content, then you can use quantity queries for that. So here's an example of a quantity query. So a quantity query, so what you have to really look at actually is the n plus. The n plus is actually just say everything above the 8th item, is the 8th item and above. And the second line actually say everything on that level. So it's 8 and above and everything around it. And what does that allow to do? Well, I'm not going to try to explain, I'm just going to show you a picture. It's easier. But that permits to target the styling depending on the amount of item on the page. So say you wanted to do a listing for a blog, but you don't know, because it's the author menu, you might only have one talk or one blog post. So you just style it like that, one big one. But say you start having 3 or a bit more, you might want to have some kind of grid layout. So you could just change your media query to target everything if there is 4 or plus. So you just have a layout like that. And say you have a lot of elements on the page, then you can simplify it. You can actually layer like that, where you hide everything which is, is not needed to make it look like a directory, so it's easier to read the information. So, and all that is amazing because it's just CSS. You don't need JavaScript, you don't need anything. It's just CSS, and it's actually the CSS actually does the math for you and layout for you. So all you have to do is plan in advance, and then you don't have to change it again. One other thing he talked about, which is kind of similar, is working at evaluating. I can never say the word, divisibility. Yeah. So that's another really important one I found from this talk. It's just a way to, same thing, to style dynamic content and how it affects the layout. So I'm going to use the example of a grid. Because grids are great, but then they aren't really suitable for dynamic content because it's just you take the item and you force it within the grid and it doesn't really adapt. So, it's really good, but you can do better with that. So say you had 9 items. So 9 is divisible by 3. Yeah. So you just can target that and actually style it. So it works out there's 3 items. Well, there's a multiple of 3 because the last item is divisible by 3. And then you style all the items around it, a bit like we had before with that, and have a grid of 33%, which means you get a nice grid of 3 by 3. But say you remove 1 item because the next page maybe there are only 8 items. Then you don't want to have, 6 and 2. So what do? You work out what's the next divisibility. So then suddenly you divide by 4 and you go 2 rows of 4, and it's nice and tidy. And obviously you can go on for that and work out a different pattern. There's an issue with primary number, but there's a way around it as well, so we'll sort it. But if you say you had orphaned elements, so you can't really sort it out, and then for that you use Flexbox, because Flexbox will actually work really well with that system as well. You can combine the two. But I'm going to let Rob talk about Flexbox more.
As Christelle mentioned, that technique is really good if you can't use Flexbox. But if you can, that's awesome. So with responsive web design, the main issue is you don't know how big something's going to be. You don't know how much space you've got, because it could be a mobile, it could be a desktop, it could be a TV, it could be anything. And also you don't know how big your content is inside. So with responsive web design, we tend to use relative units, like ems and percentages. But these are still hard-coded size, which makes it a best guess at the ideal. So for instance, we've got two elements here, and the drop-down is too small for its content, so the text is actually trimmed off, and the button is actually too big. There's too much space either side. So what we can do is we can use Flexbox to fix this. Now Flexbox gets us closer to this ideal because we can do away with units and we can just tell the browser to figure it out itself. So using that example again, we know how big the content is for those 2 elements. So we can say flex none to say to tell the browser, make this as big as the content. So that button will be the right size, and same with the drop down, it will match the size of the content that's inside it. And then for the other part, we can just say Flex Auto, which just fills up the remaining space, which is pretty cool. Another thing that Flexbox is really good for is field alignment. I don't know if any of you have tried to do this in CSS, but it can be an absolute pain, which is why things like Bootstrap have become quite popular, because they just take all of that pain away. They've already figured all that stuff out. But with Flexbox, we can do this ourselves in one line of CSS. And we can tell all of the form elements to be the same height, which basically keeps them all aligned and everything, which is really cool. And another thing that Flexbox helps with is ordering. So let's say we've got this recipe, and we've got this image in the middle. Now on desktop that's fine, but on mobile we probably want to put that at the top, because then it makes for a better reading experience. So what we can do with Flexbox is we can change the ordering without changing the HTML. And if the browser doesn't support Flexbox, then it just reverts back to the no Flexbox version, which still works, still displays. So it's a really cool use of Flexbox there.
Yeah. So one of the good, interesting talk was about web components and where really they're going and if they'll still be around. Before, only Chrome and Firefox supported web components, but now all major browsers are in, and they're going to try to work together to work out a standard. So they help working with Atomic Design that Rob mentioned earlier. So what are web components? They're just enablers to create widgets. They are reusable and encapsulated and are not affected by the CSS and the JavaScript on the rest of the page. It is similar to React or BEM with the technology we have nowadays. We all have heard of the picture element. Is that? The first one you mentioned were templates. Templates are reusable fragments of inner HTML. So you drop them in a page, but the browser will ignore them until you tell it to use it. So it's similar to our mustache. And then the bar works when you activate them with an element in JavaScript. They're also compatible with all major browsers apart from IE, but should be coming up on IE soon. So. This one, yeah. So the other one was HTML imports. So as the name said, they include HTML document in another HTML document, like you currently do with your CSS and your JavaScript. So you just put the tag, link to it, and import it. So they're quite good because they allow you to share an element just by including it. So it's quite easy. You could share it with everybody. The main big issue is that it blocks rendering. So until this is fully downloaded, the rest of it won't render. And also it might cause problem because if you had multiple HTML import on the same page and they share, for example, jQuery or something like that, it will get downloaded every time. It won't work out that it will be downloaded. So it's actually not that great. It's badly supported as well. And well, by the sound of it, it's unlikely that it's going to be developed any further because there's something in ES6 which is going to come out and probably will replace it. So something to watch out. The next one is the shadow DOM element. So shadow DOM element is a way to hide complex markup in a single element. So we've all used select. We all know about video. It's that. With the video element, all the controls are hidden away within the video tag in the shadow DOM. They're really good because they allow you to create your own element, make it super complex, but not expose it to the end user, except through an API. So there's a lot to be left to be defined, and it's not quite ready to use. So it's a bit of a grey area, I think. It could be really good, it could be really bad. Time will tell. And the final one was about custom elements. So custom element allows you to create meaningful markup. It's about naming the element with the function that is meant to perform. On its own, it's nothing special, but it can be. But once you add method and property to that object, it allows you to create individual API for every custom element, which is really, really powerful. But same thing, it probably be drop because ES6 will actually ES6 will, is there's something similar, and we'll probably end up using that.
Yeah.
So yeah. So before the web component gets defined, we're going to have to deal with a lot of rubbish web components because it's still new, it's still something in progress. So what I think we talk like I forgot his name. It was trying to say it's up to us as developer to take responsibility and actually make sure when we use them correctly. So we actually start setting up the standards ourselves. And you mentioned about something called the gold standards, which is like a checklist for web components that was created by some guys at Google.
Yeah.
I didn't write down the name, so.
It's on GitHub.
It's on GitHub.
I'll send you a link.
One other thing he suggested as well is in the days of jQuery, by using jQuery, and everybody starting with jQuery, we actually set up standards that were taken, the web took from jQueries, like the selectors earlier I was mentioning. And so he said, maybe we should all do that again by using something like Polymer. So by using a library and everybody working the same way, we could actually create our own web standard where the W3C will actually learn from how we work. So for the next thing,
yeah, so Web Components is an example of one of the web APIs. There were many others actually introduced on the day. One of them was called Geolocation API, which, as the name might suggest, actually fetches the visitor's location. Obviously, they have to give permission from the browser. The browser actually asks for permission first before we can get it. But once we have it, we can actually stream the location, and because it's streamed, we can actually make like a sat-nav style thing. So imagine like you could just go on a website, and it will actually direct you to wherever you need to go. Another one was the Web Animation API. Now, at the moment, there's a lot of competing standards for animation in the web. So there's CSS, which is very easy to use, but it's not very expressive. SMIL, which is SVG animation, is really expressive, but it's hideously complicated. And request animation frame is quite tricky to get in a sort of smooth 60 frames per second. So what they're trying to do is make an overarching API in JavaScript that handles all animation on the page, it seems quite nice. But with most of these APIs, there's very, very limited support. In fact, I think for the web one, there isn't any support at the moment. There's partial support, there's none, not fully supported. Another one is the Web Audio API. A couple of people probably use this here. This allows for a powerful, versatile way of controlling audio on the web. So it allows developers to choose audio sources. They can add effects like delays and things like that. They can even look at the audio waveform, so they can sort of create audio visualizations to display that waveform and apply spatial effects such as panning. And one of my favourites was the ambient light. It's also known as the device light event API, which provides developers with information about the ambient light sensor on your devices. So you know where your front-facing camera is, there's often like a little sensor right next to it to tell how bright the room is around you. And based on that, it'll set your phone's brightness. Well, we could actually hook into that, so in theory, we could like change the colours. Like imagine if you're reading a blog in the dark, it could actually change the website's colours from like a white to a black, so that it's easier to read. That sounds pretty cool to me. One of my favourite talks was by Jake Archibald, and he spoke about supercharging page load. So there are two methods at the moment of progressive enhancement. The first mode is the classic one, which is, say you need to support other browsers like IE6, IE7, IE8, then just code your website without JavaScript and use feature tests to figure out what you can use with modern browsers. But not all apps fit into this mold, and more complicated apps might actually require JavaScript. So his example was his SVG compiler that I showed you in my last talk. For him, he felt that for what he was trying to do, which was visualize what this optimizer was doing, providing a baseline fallback, which could have been like a post, upload the SVG and then it sends you one back in a post-back response. He felt that that wasn't really useful because no one would benefit from that. So his key point was every phase has progressive enhancement must have a real user that can benefit from it. There's a lot of like JavaScript frameworks that are quite popular now, like Angular, React, Ember, even Polymer, but they all tend to block first render. And we often use the excuse that this is a web app and not a website, but there's no user that's going to stare at a blank screen for 6 seconds on their phone going, thank goodness this is a web app and not a website. It just doesn't happen. But it's okay, because we can fix this. So instead of just slinging in one div with an ID of app and be done with it, we can basically construct the application with HTML and inline CSS so it renders it, how it's going to roughly look. And then as we load stuff in, we can replace it with the actual application parts. So Paul Lewis has done this guitar tuner. It starts off with just an orange ring, and then as the application loads, it fills it in with like the needle and the notes and all that, which is pretty cool. It also helps to load scripts and fonts asynchronously, so they don't block your first render. And nothing should have a JS-dependent first render. If you're using a framework which requires this, you just don't use it because it's already out of date. I mentioned that because people hate wasting the time people hate wasting the most is the present. So if you need to add like 100 milliseconds of the overall page time in order to save for a quick first render, that's worth doing because they're not going to notice it. They're going to be playing around. One of my favourite bits was we spoke about offline. So instead of a normal website where we go to a server, we fetch all our information, we send it back to our browser, we said put something in the middle to make it offline, and then use the network to just fetch updates. So service workers can be used for this, and they sit between the page and the network. I won't go into detail on that, but it's definitely worth checking out. And another thing he demoed, which was really, really cool, was it's so new, it's about a couple of weeks old. So imagine you don't have a connection and you try and view something on your offline web app or whatever that you haven't downloaded yet. What you could do is the browser can say, oh, well, we don't have a connection yet, but I'll let you download this in the background and I'll notify you when it's ready. That was pretty cool.
So that was more of a fun talk. The next one, it was about designing for the future, but it wasn't actually a technical talk at all. It was to do with it was a lady from the BBC who is actually a researcher at the R&D department, and she did a talk about how to design for the future as we don't know what's going to be like. But the way we used the internet 10 years ago, we all were on desktop computers. Now we all on different size, shaped devices, on the go, not at home like we used to be. So she was like, how do you go back designing for the future? So what they do at the BBC is they come up with crazy ideas and they just make it happen. So one of the projects they've worked on was something called the smart wallpapers, which she showed us a video and it's pretty awesome.
Just ignore the pink
Don't
circle.
know what it's in there.
It's part of the design.
Yeah. It's like a clue to say we're at the end of the talk. So she gave us a few tips on how to work, how to make that process a bit easier, really. So first of all, design for user experience, not on technology. So don't worry about the technology because you always find a work around it. Don't let it restrict you. Be creative and watch a lot of sci-fi movies. A lot. So obviously, to do the smart wallpapers, we didn't have the technology in place because we don't have smart wallpaper. But so they just made it up by using projectors and HTML5, canvases, and JavaScript, and all sorts of things. So we were shown a video, as I said earlier, which showed how they could update the decor around you depending on what you were watching, or maybe how they could use it to promote an event. So say you're a big Doctor Who fan and you're really excited about the new TV series starting, they could literally, like as the day passed, suddenly your picture frame on the wall would be replaced by Doctor Who things. And then you'll get little like the TARDIS appearing and flying on the side. And it'll all be animated, because obviously it's the web, so you'll get like small animation and the room will get darker and darker as the day progresses. What they also did actually is you could do games, interactive game on the wall. So they had lots of kids in the room with projection and they had to shoot things on the wall, which was quite good. So obviously that's just really, what you could do, and I think we should do it at Box. We've got projectors, don't we? I'm pretty sure we could get a day where we actually make a little game, we can project on the wall and interact with it. We've got a TV as well.
We've actually got this, like, I don't know if you can see, but there's like a little light there.
Yeah.
And that's, the reverse projector we've got that sort of like sits against the wall. That's exactly what they're using. And it's just tied to a Node front end. Mm-hmm. So it's really cool.
So, yeah.
Oh.
Yay.
No, I think it died.
So that's all really we did in the day. So thanks for coming. Don't put it there. Yeah, and we had lots of fun. We worked really hard, really.
We didn't do any sightseeing.